I have always believed in miracles.
Many nations have looked with longing eyes towards Australia.
Today, a new spirit, a new enthusiasm, a new dynamism is at work in Australia. In an often troubled and dangerous world, here we are at the gateway of a new decade.
Hello everyone. This afternoon we have Josh Michael, who is a communist, joining us today. We're on the Gold Coast, the industrially ravaged Gold Coast.
Yep, really.
And so we've got an interesting conversation today because we've been talking about communism without actually having a communist with us before now.
Lo and behold, here we have a communist.
There's dozens of us.
And so it would be really interesting to bring us along. So we're going to change up the format a little bit. Normally try and talk about a bit like the current news first, but because you've got a long history involved in communist, at least one communist organization. We'll get into that.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to kind of dive in a bit of your history. Well, first, tell us about yourself. So how would you classify yourself now?
I reckon certainly not a traditional communist by any means. I like to fashion a lot of my politics on people like Rosa Luxemburg, who was a democratic centralist who believed that a party of the people had to be filled with the people, and that all of its programs had to be decided by the people through democratic process, which is very different from Lenin. Very, very different. And I've come to believe pretty strongly in things like the right to autonomy, and the right for working class people to organize themselves as they see fit. Which can include decentralized action, direct action, all those sorts of things. So I'm somewhere between a communist and an anarchist these days.
Because I've actually got an anarcho-communist friend, but she's kind of started to adopt. She says she's just a communist now because there is a strong anarchist tradition inside communism, like anarcho-syndicalism and other elements.
A lot of people these days would probably call me an anarcho-communist of some description. I'm still a Marxist.
Okay. And so where would you say this started for you? Like, did you just walk into uni one day and radicalized academics?
No, I hate academics. I've always been pretty left-wing. Like, I grew up poor and had a pretty large chip on my shoulder most of my life. But it was very sort of aimless. And then my best friend introduced me to socialist politics, and then dragged me along to a quite humble conference about Marxist theory.
When was this, roughly?
This was back in, it had to have been 2008 or 2009. Yeah, 2008, I think. It's a long time ago. But and the thing that stuck with me was the theory. That if it wasn't for the theory, I probably would have never become a socialist.
I think you'll probably find that most of the time that's the opposite for most. A lot of communists I've met.
See, for me, I didn't need someone to tell me that inequality existed. I didn't need anyone to tell me that we had to resist inequality. I didn't need someone to explain to me black people aren't equal to white people, gay people aren't equal to straight people, and all that sort of thing. I knew those arguments, and I'd already witnessed, anti-war movements and all that sort of thing. So for a socialist to come and tell me, this is, workers should fight back and this and that and the other, it's like, well, duh. But why and how? Those are the things that mattered to me at the time.
Well, see, it's interesting to say that because I remember when I went to, it was called Education Conference, which is a university kind of conference that happens all over the country. It mostly happens like Sydney or Melbourne. But the one I went to, it was basically a broad left media conference before the actual education conference. And I remember they described socialism to me in this way. It was just, socialism is just looking out for other people. And they left it at that. They didn't go any further. And I was like, I think it's a little more complicated than that.
Just a little bit.
And they didn't want to even have that conversation. They were like,
no,
Maxim, shut the fuck up. And I was like, I'm just like, because I agreed largely what they were saying, but I just felt like you shouldn't just dumb it down for people like that.
No,
Like,
no.
it's a complicated conversation about like what these things mean and what they. Because if you just, if socialism is just caring for people, what were the Nazis doing? If that's socialism, you know?
Yeah.
It's not socialism, but
No.
my point is, if you don't clarify what it
I hope
is,
no one listening to this thinks it is. That would
Yeah.
be awkward.
but you get my point. Like, if you don't clarify what it is and what this stands
that's
for,
exactly right.
it
Well, I
doesn't.
mean, just to throw in a little tangent there for
Yeah.
a second. Like the daddy of its fascism, like Mussolini and the Italians.
Yeah.
A lot of them were communists initially, and a lot of them were socialists initially, and then they moved forward into what would become fascism. So, like, just saying, "Oh, well, socialism's about caring for people." Well, by that logic,
Yeah.
Mussolini and the Italian fascists were just an evolution of that
Yeah.
caring for people, just in Italy, and if you were white.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's but that's at least like the conversations I've had a lot of the time. That's what I feel very frustrated, at least. But then, so you really have gone to theory. Like, do you have any particular theorists or?
Well, Marx, Marx and Engels, I think, are the foundation.
Yeah.
I think Rosa Luxemburg, who I said
Yeah.
informs a lot of my politics. She was fire, man.
Yeah.
She
Did you discover like early on, or did you discover a bit later?
both. To
Okay.
be honest. She made excellent analyses of things like the adaptation of capital, the role of war in
Yeah.
capitalism and imperialism. She expressed pretty ideally what democratic centralism should be. And one of the things I really liked about her is that she spent the majority of her political life involved in the SPD, the German Social Democratic Party.
Yeah.
And she only left at the point that the SPD turned quite reactionary.
Yeah.
And that was around the time that German society was getting quite fiery and fed up, and working class rebellions and all that sort of thing. And the SPD refused to support.
Was she a member of the KPD?
She founded the KPD.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, with
I didn't
Karl
realize.
Liebknecht.
Yeah.
I think that's how you pronounce his surname.
Yeah.
God, now I'm going on a tangent. Redirect me.
So I think you're talking about theorists.
Yeah.
Because not the spoiler warning. We're going to talk about the Socialist Alternative, which is so it's definitely it's definitely like fourth international kind of derivatives.
Gotta love me some Trotsky.
Yeah. So this is what I was thinking, because I've had conversations with you about Trotsky before.
Yeah.
And so was Trotsky in that early stages, and then I think he's declined for you.
Yeah, very Trotskyist politics, specifically Cliffite Trotskyism. That was really my first introduction to socialism, and that came with a lot of caveats of reactionism in its own right.
Yeah.
Particularly around Bolshevism.
Yeah.
The total lack of willing to self-criticize certain things like Kronstadt and a few other bits, but
big oopsies in the Russian
big
war.
oopsies. But at the same time, there were some good lessons to be learned in that area of things. Like I quite liked Trotsky's analysis of the workers' state, quote unquote, as being degenerated. Which there's a lot of things to discuss about that, but I think that's quite an important distinction to make, and it's something that Cliffites didn't actually follow through with.
Oh, right, okay. So they were defending the USSR whilst also like being Trotsky as a good guy.
No, it's more like Cliffites decided to take a turn away from that analysis of degeneration into state capitalism, which state capitalism is essentially saying the state runs capitalism. And it's bureaucratized and
which has another name, fascism.
But if you ask anyone who's actually spent a lot of time with socialist politics and generally understanding the theory of anarchist theory, Marxist theory, even social democratic politics as a whole, left theory, that whole state capitalist idea starts to degrade a bit.
Well, there's an important question to ask, because a lot of this will have to relate to modern Australian society, for instance, and there's there's a talking point I hear from time to time whenever communism comes up and goes, oh, well, it's an outdated concept. It's Marx was writing from a
19th century perspective.
Yeah, and even Luxemburg and Lenin and everyone else, they're coming from European perspectives of the 20th century from that time, and even the non-European communists, their theories were based in very different worlds at very different times. Do you think that communism effectively, how do you update it, and how do you keep it for a 21st century appeal? Because ultimately you want to spread the ideology.
Yeah, of course. I think that's been a real struggle for communist parties in particular, and your old guard really. During the 60s and 70s, there was a huge pushback from the communist parties and other communist-leaning trade unions, where they essentially refused to adopt the programs of national liberation movements, queer liberation, women's liberation, black civil rights. They just became really hostile toward that because they were class reductionist. They thought that the only battle was class, and that everything that needed to change culturally, systemically, would happen after you got rid of class. So that was a major struggle in the mid-20th. And to get out of that rut, we had people like Malcolm X, who's technically a Maoist, who kind of brought a lot of the communist ideas, like of working class power and black power to a more modern sensibility. You had you carry that forward with people like Angela Davis, who's another black revolutionary.
Yeah, for sure.
Groups like the GLF, Gay Liberation Front. They were also quite informed by socialist politics. Marxist feminism is a big one, which also kind of fed into the whole intersectional feminism as well. So I think in terms of updating and keeping things, I guess, fresh, if you want to say, it comes down to the inclusion of new ideas into your analysis of the world. And I think Marxists, if they're not willing to do that, they can't call themselves Marxists.
Well, and there's another. Well, I think that's true. Ultimately, if you don't follow the core principles, then you can't really call yourself the thing that you're being. However, there's another issue, which is, for background, to people who are listening, my heritage is Croatian. My father came from Yugoslavia when it was under Tito, and will rage against any mention of socialism or communism or anything of that ilk, anything kind of left-wingy, he'll go, oh, that's some fucking bullshit. Do you know, like, I saw it firsthand in the Socialist Republic of Croatia and stuff like that. The question is, how do you go and make this ideology appealing to people who've been fucked by it already?
I mean, that's a really hard thing to do. Like, let's face it. There are some people that you're not going to make any headway with, and you do have to accept that. But really, the tactic or the principle you should hold to is, how do I actually connect the dots for people who are struggling, without making it all about my revolution and my politics are right? And the answer to that is, look at their struggle as a working class person. Where do they fit? Say, if they're middle class, where do they fit into the strata of society? And kind of try to illustrate where their struggle in society is coming from. So your average worker, they're not going to give a shit about socialist politics or communist politics. What they give a shit about is, are they being exploited? How are they being exploited? What can they do about it? And that's things like, organize yourselves, make democratic process in your workplace, etc., etc.
Do you feel it's the label that is the problem, or do you feel it's actually like a problem with ideology? Do you think, because like I find half the time, if you characterize something in a certain way, like sometimes without a communist label or sometimes with a communist label, it totally changes the way that person interprets that conversation from the beginning, if you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Do you feel like that's the current problem? Is this the basically the USSR or even modern
brand,
China?
basically.
The brand and how it's interpreted now is so negative that it's hard to then move the conversation out of that.
Yeah, I think the brand. it took some serious hits. Like, you know, McCarthyism was a thing, the Red Scare, and genuine people forced into terrible situations by these governments and regimes. Like, you know, the USSR persecuted dissenters incessantly, you know, anarchists, what have you. And you can't defend that. You cannot defend that. So I won't.
But then, okay, so this is a bit of, we know someone mutually
yes,
who I have constant debates about this with.
Slightly different from sure,
but in terms of like, how do you feel about those people? And I know in this particular case he's a bit younger, so I'm not going to like hate on him specifically, but it's, you know, this is not unusual. Like, there's a lot of people, like say in the CPA I found, or I don't know necessarily about the SALT, but I know a lot of people in CPA necessarily will be like, no, I'm my hill to die on is the USSR, and I will die here. I will defend everything they ever did ever. And it's like, how is this like a constructive conversation? Because it's really, look, I can defend some things they did, I can say other things were bad, but I think it's the best way. Because on like my overall perspective on the USSR is there's a bunch of really good lessons about how they did things. You can say they're bad things, good things, it's not the point. Is that the reasons they failed is so interesting to me because it shows how like a whole society like collapses, even though a lot of people still believed in the system. Like, how does that happen, and how do you get out of that? And I can see the similar situation happening in the United States. Like, that system is collapsing on itself, whilst I'm sure most people believe in the United States as an entity. You know what I mean? Like, why is this happening? And I think, so I'll leave it at that. But my point is, why do you think that those elements still exist on some level? Like, why are the people still like?
Also, just interject everything.
Yeah.
As in, like, defend everything. So, the deportation of the Chechens, for instance, and putting the Volga Germans in Kazakhstan, and like
the many issues with the Ukraine.
Proposing
the Holodomor,
proposing a weird Jewish state in Siberia,
which they made. Might I add?
Like, you know, there's so many issues there, but I'm trying not to like just hate on it. Like, there is
no. Like, this is constructive conversation. This is things that should come up.
Because I think ultimately universal healthcare, like ultimately especially the early parts of the revolution, like when Lenin wasn't like dead, like they pushed through like things that were just like they got rid of the criminalization of homosexuals, they pushed for women's liberation, like there was all these things that are good. Yes, this is good stuff, and this is way before anyone else is doing it, pretty much. You know, great, good stuff, yo.
And also, they had entrepreneurs, for instance. Like communist entrepreneurs were a big thing in the early USSR because they had to fuel the economic base of the new state.
Well, it's for Lenin to electrify. Like, he wanted like electricity to be connected to all households inside the USSR. So you have to speak to all these old industrialists and be like, how do I do this? And you basically got them jobs and basically said, you're in charge of industrializing and electrifying all of the Union Soviet and Socialist republics. You know what I mean?
Mouthful. Yeah.
You know what I mean? So like, I think it gets very complicated very quickly. But so anyway, my point is, so the USSR, like, why are these people still defending it in such an uncritical way? Like, is it just like, are they being paid by the CCP? Are they? You know what I mean? Like, what's the end game here?
I think a big part of it, I'm sure if you ask them about a number of issues that just came up, they're bound to say something liberal. And it really is, at least from my perspective about that, there's such a kind of clusterfuck of misinformation perpetuated by liberal democracies about countries, and the real stuff gets thrown in the mix of all that. And I think there's a lot of defensiveness, and at the same time, I guess there's also people that like to say things couldn't have gone any differently, that the conditions of the time made it so. And I mean, to some degree, that is correct. Like, we will never see a Soviet Russia of that kind again. I don't think we will. We might see oppressive regimes, but the conditions of the 1917 revolution, the 1920s in Russia, very, very different. It was
and they are unique. Like those conditions are unique to a time that will never happen again.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right.
Serfs in Russia will not be a thing anytime soon.
we don't live in peasant economies anymore. Like, yeah. So there are a few reasons why I guess people would be really defensive and not budge on those things.
Like, there's a good argument. Like, I can understand some arguments about, like, it was how, like, there's a Richard Wolff, who's that Marxist economist or whatever. I think that's what he's
quote unquote.
Yeah. Well, he makes this argument basically saying that the USSR, because it was the first time that anyone had ever done this before, that you can forgive some of the early misgivings of the government because it tries to. And I'm like, that's not a bad argument. You don't excuse all of it, but I can understand that they're trying to create a whole new system of government, and they're going to fail definitely in the early stages. That's not the worst argument I've ever heard.
No, it's not entirely wrong. I mean, creating a project that flies against the new world, it's not an easy thing. And I think a lot of people, because you'll hear people go, oh, show me one example of a successful communist country or this and that. And it's just like, show me one example during feudalism of a successful capitalist country.
Yeah.
It didn't exist because it's not like that.
Well, I mean, to attempt an answer to that, just quickly. I mean, you could make the argument, just hypothetically, put on our ANCAP hats. Well, you could go and say,
Mises is the master.
Austrian school. You can go and say, well, the Italian city-states, for instance, but they were also ran by mercenaries and were not democratic in any sense. Also, mercantilism was a thing. Like the history here is irrelevant, but like there's answers, but the answers are wrong sometimes. And also that name one successful. Rant time. I fucking hate when people go and say, "Oh, name one successful communist country." Well, Soviet Union was pretty fucking successful for as long as it ran. I mean, also like, China.
Yeah.
For one, like if we take the Chinese at their word that they're communists, then you have to say like, oh, well, that's a successful communist country. It's going to be the largest economy on the planet.
It's a very one-sided metric as well. Like you'll have these people, their judgment of whether they're a success or failure is how equal the society was and how little it hurt people within the society. So they'll be quick to get on the high horse about China, Russia, etc. But then can be completely uncritical of places like the US, Canada, Australia, Europe, or Eastern Europe rather. And you cannot shy away from the fact that mass poverty exists in the world, and you have to say that actually capitalism created these conditions. We don't see mass resources taken from poor countries because they're communists. No, we see that because capitalist industry does that.
Also, I think there's another problem with all of this, and it's being someone who loves history. It's a problem of people taking the history and trying to use it for their own ends. For quick tangent, because we are in the shadow of COVID-19, I have a friend of mine, very good friend, who tried to say, oh well, everything that happened in 1920s is going to happen again because it's mirroring everything that happened. Like, especially with
history is cyclical.
Yeah, with the Spanish flu, to which I responded with thus, and I think it works with this conversation here, which is you have to think of the world in 1920. Never mind the Russian Civil War, which goes to our communist conversation, but there were communist revolutions everywhere. Every country in the former empires had a communist revolution, like bar none. Anything east of the Rhine was in the middle of a fucking revolution, basically. The world wasn't nearly as connected, wasn't nearly as informed. Like they take history and they go and say, oh well, these things happened. Ergo, my ideology is supported by X, Y, and Z factors without putting into consideration the world that these people lived in. So like, oh, well, Lenin was violent. Yeah, Lenin was a fucking German puppet initially. You have to remember. Had the Kaiserreich won the war, like
they probably would have not allowed that to last much longer.
No.
Have you ever seen that? It's on YouTube. There's this Bertrand Russell recounting a conversation he
Yes,
had with Lenin.
Yeah, yeah.
And he talks about how Lenin joked about pitting the poor peasants against the rich peasants, and how the poor peasants strung the rich peasants up. And then Bertrand ends it with, "I didn't much like that."
Yeah.
Yeah, I have seen that.
Yeah,
He also
great.
says something about he thought he was less articulate than he thought he would be, or something
No,
like that.
he was actually surprised by how articulate
Oh,
he
okay.
was, because
Yeah.
he thought they'd be speaking in Russian, but he spoke in German.
Yeah,
And his
yeah.
German was quite good.
Well, I mean,
There you go.
the Kaiser's agents were pretty good at teaching his German. But that's the big point of all of this. And I think people who defend the USSR tooth and nail, for some reason, Central Asia. Anyway, it gets to a very strange thinking, which when our conversation gets to the United States later on, it'll come up again, which is, it's my side's right no matter the cost.
Yeah.
Right? Like, all the faults can be justified and excused and taken out of their context or manipulated for the context of the conversation you're having at the time. Shit like that. It's factionalism, effectively.
I think that's it. I think the other thing is like, the thing I've always encountered is that basically these people usually want something to oppose the United States on some level, and they'll pick anything that does this, whether it's Bashar al-Assad or it's Putin or it's Xi Jinping. They just need any of them to oppose the United States.
It's really unnecessary too, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because, you can be critical of literally everyone
Yeah.
who does anything wrong.
Yeah.
It's not hard.
And
Trust me. My Facebook feed is full of it.
But this is the thing, like, I think, I understand that desire, because, like, whilst I think this is another question I've got for you, but this will lead into that, is that once the USSR collapsed, I think on some level, whilst it was probably obviously a big backlash for communism everywhere, on the other hand, I think it's actually allowed for a different type of communism to arise. Like, there's different conversations happening inside. Well, maybe not.
I would actually agree with that. Yeah,
Like,
I think that's true.
Because, and obviously it's not completely true, but because Moscow directed a lot of the talking points and conversations and rhetoric and theory about communism, and as it was changing, like, now that it's gone, that conversation's completely decentralized.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well,
And, like,
not for long. Hail Uncle Xi.
but you get my point. Like,
Yeah.
there's a possibility for communism that's not attached to any of that.
Yeah.
And actually start from a new place.
I do agree with that sentiment, because for the better half of the 20th century, or better 20th century in general, the Communist Party of the USSR was essentially directing communism across the world.
Yeah, like, you did have,
including in
obviously,
China.
You had, like, Yugoslavia, you had China break away at one point, you had Albania, right?
Yeah.
But they're not major influences.
No.
And they weren't really changing that much. They just didn't like being told what to do most of the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very strange thing with, when you have an enemy, you need an ally, right?
Yeah.
I think, so if you're an ardent communist of any stripe, of any of the different brands and flavors of communism, well, if your enemy is capitalism, and if your enemy is the big bad American devil,
Yeah.
or in our case, the Australian devil, well then,
No, leave the Australian devil alone, man.
hey,
It's a little critter. Jeez.
the Tasmanian devil's fine, full of syphilis, but fine. But the thing is that when you have an enemy, and if you think in this dichotomy, this black and white thinking of bad capitalism, bad,
Yeah.
well then you need a friend,
Yeah.
and if your friend doesn't exist, then you need to invent one, and then you go look to the past. I think I think the people who are most guilty of this, besides, like, the 6 communists who exist anymore, it's people on the right. I mean, Australia is not as bad with this, because our political environment is just a clown show. Like, it's, but you go to look to Americans, for instance, and think of how they look to their past, and it's like, well, everything we did was perfectly justified and was perfectly fine, because our big bad enemy is, what's the flavor of the week? Like,
Venezuela.
Yeah. Yeah.
Venezuela,
Cuba.
Islam, Iran, or ideas,
Yeah.
terrorism, communism. Like,
Antifa.
Yeah. Which is now a terrorist organization.
Oh dear God. But like everyone can commit the sin, I think.
Yeah.
And
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
This is all kind of, it's reminding me a lot of some conversations I've had with a very good friend of mine who's, a major in philosophy. Fantastic. He trolls everyone with it. But it's this idea of like, we can use history as a gauge of what is, because certain things do happen repeatedly in history. For example, economic crises.
Yeah.
We've seen these play out many times. We know the nature of them. We can generally gauge the impact of them.
Yeah.
Say like the current recession in Australia that's essentially going to get worse. We know how that's going to play out to some degree. But at the same time, like, and this is for me as a Marxist pretty important, just because you know what has happened doesn't mean you can absolutely say what will happen. Yeah.
But what history can give you is a guess.
Yeah.
And you can hopefully try to avoid those situations. I'm just going to quickly look up a situation that happened a long time ago, but it happened in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Many of you will not know what the fuck that is. However, its collapse and demise, it's to give you an idea of history, for instance, and trying to ascertain the future from the past, which is what a lot of people do. It's what a lot of right-wingers do when they go and say, oh, well, if the communists take over, then every banker is going to be put up against the wall and shot, or what have you.
I mean...
not now.
We're trying to make you look good, okay?
Get the stiffy over here.
No, I'll continue with the conversation. I'll bring up in a second.
Okay,
but
sure. Well, the other thing. Okay, so we'll go back to a bit of your history then. So you've discovered socialism. You've kind of worked yourself into communism. You've really gone into theory. So you've kind of attached yourself to like Rosa Luxemburg and Trotsky.
Yeah.
So when did you join SALT? Like who?
SALT was the terrible thing that introduced me to socialist politics. They are the ones that provided that foundation. Explained the theory of Marxism in very layman's terms, but enough.
Do you remember how you were recruited? What they said to you that was like, oh man, that makes a lot of sense? Or
well, they came up to me while I was there and said, oh, how did you like it? Blah, blah. It was very similar to anyone in any kind of get together, and
sure.
And like for me, it was like I had in the back of my mind when I went to this place, and I'd spoken to my mum about it, and she said, "Just be careful; these places can be like cults." And so I had that in the back of my mind. Guard up, don't be too friendly. But at the time, they were friendly enough. So I went to a couple of meetings after that, and joined. And for a little while it was good. For a little while it was good. They spend a lot of time really hammering in some important lessons. Specifically discipline, which funnily enough, but some disciplinary lessons that I learned was how I should conduct myself as a man in socialist circles. How I should conduct myself as a white person.
Sure.
And all these sorts of things. How to have these opinions, but also make room for the opinions of people who are
oppressed. That's not necessarily bad,
and that was really useful. And I will admit that at the time, I was nowhere near as mature as I am now. So I did have my faults, but today that has made such a big difference. So they did give me some good things, I will say.
I think it's all a learning experience. Like I've talked about this before, but like when I was, this is like, when I was a bit more into like the new atheist movement, I thought Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins.
Oh man, I was
like,
on there too.
Like once upon a time, I thought they were quite interesting, and it was interesting debate. And like I think definitely I fell into that trap for a while, and then I broke out of it eventually. But it did take a while for me to learn. Okay, I need to mature it. But I took some elements of that where I was like, I do like some of these conversations and some of the elements, some of the arguments. But ultimately, it's just that I think they fall flat at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But it's just like. You know what I mean? Like, I think you can still, like, I think there's been a certain level of forgiveness, and I don't think this happens often in the left necessarily, but just like, especially when you're young, you go down these rabbit holes where you think this is a really good idea, or you're just really fascinated by it, and then you're like, okay, wait, like
Yeah,
you don't
absolutely.
realize that until you're out of it.
My best piece of advice for anyone who's new to left politics or socialist politics is learn how to mitigate yourself and your expectations, because the reality is you don't know everything, and you can be as fiery as you like.
Yeah.
You will not have all the answers, and you will get shut down many times. You need to be willing to accept a short-term defeat and use that as a learning opportunity.
Yeah.
And you really shouldn't be coming up to people like me who are 32 years old and you're 18 going, fuck you, I know all this. And it's like, man, I've been there. Like, mellow out. No, but that's happened to me a few times, and it's sadly it's quite normal for a lot of people that are new to those sorts of things.
And I don't blame them. Like, it's good they have that passion. I like that passion.
Oh yeah, the passion's great. It just needs to be better directed. Like,
yeah. Like, that's the thing, because I find often, especially, maybe not people our age, because I'm a bit younger than you.
Yeah.
But like, people are a bit older, but like, especially, when we get into the boomers, maybe 40, 50-year-olds, they're like, it will pass over. Like, well, I'm not worried about anything.
The older you get, the more conservative you get.
Yeah, I don't want to talk about politics and religion in dinner. Like, you know what I mean? Like,
I hate it at my house.
Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, these conversations need to be had, and they
exactly.
have no concerns outside the little purview of their life. You know what I mean? So I hate that. So I like the passion of these groups often. Like when, I think it was Salt who did that thing on Q&A a few years back, where they just dropped that banner in the middle of the thing and just started.
Oh yeah, it was too, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Was it?
I think it was.
Maybe. Yeah, it was. Okay. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, that wasn't the worst thing they've ever done.
That was pretty good.
Yeah. I can't remember what they were protesting now. Do you remember?
I feel like, God, what was it? Because this was back in, was that 2014?
It was a couple of years. Yeah, it was a couple of years ago. I just remember the event itself.
I can only imagine that it's. What were the issues at the time? It was either refugees.
It probably was refugees, actually.
I think it would have been. Refugees are indigenous issues.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, indigenous issues, but once you said refugees, I was like, that's probably especially after
bad
2013.
that we can't remember.
Yeah.
A lot of stuff happens in 6 years.
This is the problem with spectacle politics.
Yeah,
often you remember the
exactly.
spectacle and not the...
I always remember the shoe throwing, so there's that, and Egg Boy.
Yeah.
Yeah, boy.
Yeah, boy.
But it wouldn't surprise me in a couple of years' time, maybe not us, but other people who are a bit younger will remember the incident.
Yeah.
Remember why he did it.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Well, isn't it I think in the first recording we had, like, Romper Stomper was the homework of the week, and the big, it was all about the new Australian political dynamic of where left and right, and they're fighting each other in the street. And it's about immigration. It's about Islam and all that, like all that good shit. Gone. Fairy dust. Right nowadays, like the idea of it just seems like a tired talking point now.
Yeah. There's
Or like it happened 40 years ago when it was two. Like or the gay rights thing, which came and went like a distraction.
Yeah.
Like, I mean,
the world didn't end.
No, the sky didn't fall down. Like, it just seems like, a lot of these political issues come and go, and people just ignore it.
Yeah.
Like,
But this is, I think this is kind of the thing though. Like, this is going to be a bit of a tangent, but just excuse myself for a second. There's like a whole idea, like with inside the Labour Party, for example, that like say with those certain social issues, with say like marriage equality or whatever it may be, they will like the Labour Party adopting a pro marriage equality stance was not until Kevin Rudd did in like 2013.
Oh yeah, that bothered me too.
That took so long for that to happen.
Making queer members of the Labour Party stand against marriage equality as well was like awful.
There's a bit of dirty.
Wait, what? Really?
Yeah. Well, there was this. Okay, so here's. Do you want a story?
Hang on.
No, this is about.
I'm gonna hold the rage. Hang on.
So at national, it was state conference. There was a person in Labour right who the right got up to say, we're not going to fight for marriage equality because this is actually, I don't know, with some reason it was like politicizing the issue, or this is exploiting us, or something. Like they used some real DeWart logic to try and make this happen. And I afterwards, like, I was a bit naive. This was like 2014. It's probably around the same time.
Yeah.
I was only in the party for a couple of months, and I went to this conference, and I was like, that was very strange for you to do that. And I went up and talked to him about it, going, I do not understand what you were doing. And he was getting really angry with me that I was even challenging. And once again, I maybe wasn't articulating myself the best, but I was just so bewildered by this experience, going like, don't you feel like you're being used, or like, you know? And there's definitely, like, I may be articulating myself better than I was then.
Yeah.
So definitely put that into reference there, that I probably was not saying it in the best way.
Maturing process.
Yeah. But at the time, I was just like, like, my brain was just so confused by this. And that was like, this is also when the right were trying to court me.
Yeah.
We're like, oh, you should join the right. Come on.
I forget that happens. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was like, because I hadn't joined a faction yet, so I was like, oh, I don't know. Because I knew some people on the right that were okay, but then more I saw, the more I was like, these people are a bit off. But yeah, sorry, Ryan, you can go now.
No, I was. No, it was just occurring to me as you were talking, like, and just talking about the fuckery of politics. It's just unvirtuous, like, also, like, I'll be talking about this more in depth when we get to the American conversation. But I'm kind of in the Aristotle or the ancient Greek school of thought when it comes to politics. That
Philosopher Kings.
No. As humorous as that would be, but I like music too much. Anyway, for context, read The Republic, you fucking dullards. Anyway, no, that life is politics, and that human beings are ultimately political animals.
Oh, that's absolutely true.
Yeah, and it infuriates me that I had to be brought up in a country where they're animals, but not political animals. That's to put it, I guess. Yeah. And I love Australia. Like, I'm a diehard patriot for this country. But for God's sake, like,
just wish people were a bit more invested in it.
Well, yeah. I mean, here's the thing. Like, when I say unvirtue isn't a word. No, a lack of virtue, I should say. Yeah. This goes for both parties. This goes for every party, actually. Ultimately, like the Malcolm Roberts stupidity. For instance, or One Nation's fuckery, for instance, where it's just like, oh, let's change out the flavor of the year for who we're gonna fucking hate. Now, this year it's gonna be Antifa. Before it was Muslims, and now before that it was the Asians.
Yeah, those chip shops, man.
But when it comes to our politics, we're just gonna align with the liberals anyway. So like, what's the point of your existence, for one? And then you go to like everything that we talk about Labour. Actually makes me want to smash my head in with a brick. Well, I'll give you a headache.
Two more stories.
And don't get me started on the libs, which I will very shortly.
I was about to say, don't get me started on Jackie Lambie.
Oh, fuck. Yeah.
Two more stories quickly. So this is the one, I think what you were referring was Penny Wong. Right?
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Penny Wong is a out and out lesbian woman, and she basically, everyone knew her stance basically, and Julia Gillard basically said, you have to agree that we are not going to back this, okay?
Yeah.
We are not backing marriage equality, okay? And like Penny Wong had to go out there and outwardly defend against her own rights.
Yeah.
For like a good, I don't know how long it was. It was during the prime ministership of.
Yeah, it was until Bill Shorten.
Yeah, and but then
reset the platform.
Yeah, we kind of like, this is the thing.
Sort of.
So here's my second story. At national conference, I think it was 2016. I might be wrong about this, but it was a national conference after the 2013 election, but probably was 2016. Basically, the left were trying to push this, that we would adopt a national marriage equality platform. And Bill Shorten took the key members who were supporting that into a room away from the conference so they couldn't vote on that policy.
Wow.
And
what?
And so the left had to basically, what's the word? What's the thing when American politicians get up and talk for ages to block a bill?
Oh, filibuster.
The left had to filibuster for like a good 2 hours. Just talking on stage and not letting the right take the stage.
Also, for the record, 2-hour filibuster, that's weak sauce. Get some Ron Paul fucking...
Unfortunately, these conferences have to end within a day or two. So like, but the point is, they filibustered for ages until it happened. So, Laura Fraser Hardy was a candidate for Bonner, actually did that. And I thought it was like one of the best stories about it. I was like, oh, that's so good. Like, fucking fantastic. She didn't win, of course, but, you know, as these things happen. But point is like, you know, this is the party. I think the problem with the party is that the right have these perceptions about the Labour membership, and there are conservative members of the Labour Party. Don't get like more socially conservative than economically, but there are some economic conservatives too. But just it's more that they feared that they would lose certain areas. And then when the marriage equality vote came out, there was that Western Sydney, which has been a Labour heartland for ages, came out as massively against the no, massively voted no.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So there's these Labour communities who are all anti-electoral. So I think there's a truth to it, but I think they overblew how much it was going to impact the Labour Party. And so because they hold out so long, it just hurts them in the long run. Is my main point with the Labour Party there. They hold out so long to change sometimes, and then they go like, okay, if we just adopt it quickly, and then we never talk about it again, we don't have to worry about it. Like, it's all solved now.
On the note
You know
of
what I
the
mean?
marriage equality thing, I do want to say, just as an insert here, it crushes my soul to hear people sort of box that whole campaign into it was a Labour prerogative, when for 10 years grassroots campaigners had been fighting for it. With no assistance from the Labour Party. I remember Queer Collective at UQ, even SALT being there from the earliest days. So credit where that's due.
Well, that's the thing about it. Like, when it was happening, at the time, I guess you could say, I was in and out of the alt-righty thing. But for me, I was just thinking, the media's playing this up over and over and over and over again. But there are giant issues. And also, why now? Because I've, even then I noticed that, LGBT activists. Yeah. I noticed it was hard not to notice, especially when you saw people so passionately.
We love our confetti, man. We love our confetti.
That glitter, holy shit. But that's the thing. It just came up, and then it was a big distraction that's what I thought at the time. Big ass distraction. And then it was gone, like that, and it was played off as a big liberal, not liberal, sorry, a Labour. This is another problem with the Liberal Party. Fuck you for taking the word liberal. You confuse me a lot here. Anyway, point is, where were these activists? Like, why weren't they celebrating this victory? Like why aren't they on the stages constantly, all the time? Like,
do you mean being celebrated?
Yeah,
more so than celebrating.
Like it was their victory. They fought tooth and nail for this, and then a political party came in and swooped it from under them.
It's all about the parliamentary politics, in my opinion. It's this idea that the only route of change is through that electoral process.
Sure.
And it's really a way of neutering the idea of working class politics and the common people politics, organizing outside of that to affect some change.
Well, I think you got to. For my personal opinion, is you got to do both. I think you should try and do both as the best you can. I think there are definitely problems inside the Labour Party, but I agree that I think they are pushing change a lot of the time, because I see a lot of the policy formation happen. So for me, as an insider, I see that happen. For a lot of people who don't understand they don't see those internal dynamics happening, where people are pushing policies and trying to change things. That's my conflict.
One of the maturing lessons I learned was a diversity of tactics. Because for ages I was like, strictly militancy, revolutionary politics, and I didn't have room for like this kind of pacifist approach or electoral approach. Whereas, today I understand that we need to be diverse in how we attack issues. So we do have to agree that Parliament has some clout in an issue. Pacifism, insofar as a movement, people like to say Martin Luther King Jr. and so on. That has a role to play, but we also need to be willing to become angry and facilitate that anger as well.
But that goes to another point, which is no one person uses one tool in their toolbox, for instance.
Exactly.
And no good strategist will ever use just one thing. Like the greats of the military world and the greats of the political world, they've always used a great variety of things. It just seems to me like the political parties of this country, when they pull out their toolbox, it's some rusty fucking thing that they've had there for 5 years, that kind of thing. It's like, oh yeah, I gotta go fix the fence now, and then they pull it out, it's been rusty, that they haven't fucking looked at it for yonks, and it's like they'll use the same tools over again.
And this is the thing. So definitely, obviously, I think Labour Party is the best party. I don't want to just I'm not trying to hate on the party either. I'm just trying to define this line. I think it's good to be critical of the party because there are problems that need to be solved. So there is a middle class element of the Labour Party that I really don't like, where they just have no idea. It's not quite inner city, though there's a factor, but they just have no idea of like not necessarily just working class people, but just people who are poor or whatever, and they're just like, I remember I couldn't go to something because I didn't have a car or I didn't have money for fuel, and they were just like, why not? Why can't you just come?
Yeah.
Why can you just get money? Why do you not have money? And I'm like, because I just don't. I'm sorry. Like, I'm poor. I'm on Centrelink.
Organization. I tell you what.
You know what I mean? Like,
Actually,
yeah. But we should probably direct it. It's gonna get the hate train going on Salt again.
Yeah, no, but like, don't worry, I will. See, for me, the reason I started with this conversation, it was going to lead to Salt. It was talking about these two things. One, it's about virtue and about actually believing in the principles you preach.
Yeah.
And then talking about ultimate conclusions, like something I wish I did from the get-go of entering political life, which is, so for instance, when people go say, oh, you're a labor hack to me, I chuckle and go, I bring out the usual like list of things. One of those, again, would be with Paul Keating, right?
Yeah.
I mention East Timor. I will always mention East Timor and be like, this
It's a good example. It's hard to defend.
he sacrificed his principles for economic benefit.
Yeah.
And knowingly allowed the genocide to continue. And then gave the victory to John Howard in the end, right? Because he didn't follow through with what he actually believed in and what the country should believe in, right? And Labour Party does this all the time. The Liberals do it to a point where I want to actually overthrow Canberra, like with red flags flying everywhere. I'm like,
Canberra is the new Bastille.
Okay, like as an example, when Sam Dastyari got caught being a prostitute to China, for instance, right? The people who I laughed at the most weren't people supporting Sam Dastyari. It was the Liberal Party members who had taken hundreds of thousands of dollars from Americans and from corporate interests.
Yeah.
Right? Oh, just because the prostitute happens to work with a private company, somehow that's better? No. Like, you fucking unprincipled swine who proclaim your greatness and yet follow nothing you believe in, right? This is the biggest problem in Australian politics.
Yeah.
And then you go to ultimate conclusions, which is that's why I mentioned the gay thing initially, was I wish I'd started when talking to the anti-LGBT marriage thing and just go, okay, what's your ultimate conclusion? Do you just want the vote to pass or fail, or is there some, like, what's your agenda? Like what's if they just said, oh, well, I want the vote to pass because I want to marry my husband or my wife, hey, cool beans. But if you had another agenda behind that, especially if you're some conservative who goes, oh, I'm doing this for family values, really? Okay. What's your ultimate conclusion? I wish I did that earlier, and I'm trying to now. But it goes to Salt, which is how principled do you think Salt was while you remember, and what they are now, and what is their ultimate conclusion? Like, what is their aim?
I think most members of Salt aren't that well thought out in terms of theory and why.
I got a story there, but I'll let you talk.
And to be fair, it's because a lot of them are young and new to these ideas.
Yeah.
And they're really only parroting the stuff that they generally hear.
Yeah.
And, they get passionate about. But I think, like, the way it was described to me as a member of Salt, which they didn't need to tell me anyway, but, okay, was that things like marriage equality pose a direct threat to traditional marriage and relationships and gender norms.
Sure.
So by encroaching on that territory of conservative traditional values, not only are we fighting for our own equality, but we're also kind of throwing a wrench in the works of what society treats as normal.
Sure. Okay.
And, with queer movements and feminist movements of the past, that's exactly what they were doing. So I see things like marriage equality as being a part of that tradition. But, marriage equality is certainly not the end result. It should be more. It should be a lot more.
Yeah, well, that's... I mean, it's not even a passing thought anymore, right?
Yeah.
I mean, okay,
besides someone like Tony Abbott,
Yeah.
you know,
Oh, for goodness.
he's probably still thinking about it.
100%. There is a term from ancient Greek philosophy called telos, which basically means the purpose, right? So, and because it was made up by the wanker Greek philosophers, it usually ended up into a political concept where it's like, the blacksmith's telos is to make a sword. The soldier's telos is to kill his enemies. The political telos is for the power of the state. Eventually you have this line. The reason I asked about SALT is is there a guiding, is there a telos to what they're doing? Like, are they just doing this because it's like, fuck capitalism, like I'm edgy because I'm not the norm, or is there an actual?
Are they planning for the storming? They're are they shooting the czars?
They're ready for Canberra. They are democratic centralist in the Bolshevism sense.
Okay.
So for them, their idea of what they're doing is to forge an organization that will serve as essentially the spear of working class rebellion.
Okay.
Which means for them, some of the things that are most important is ideological purity,
Yes.
which I'm sure everyone's heard about before.
Yes.
Which is also why they won't let people like syndicalists or anarcho-communists
That seems
into
counterproductive.
their... it's really quite...
So where's the line they draw then? So like, is it some? Okay, so because my understanding, because I remember talking to you about this a while ago. They're a variant of fourth internationalist thought.
There's a variant upon a variant upon a variant.
Yeah, but because that is fourth internationalism.
Yeah.
It's basically Trotskyism.
Yeah,
The Tim Tam salted caramel of
So-
communism.
And I think that's the last one. There's a talk of a fifth one, but point is that's the whole idea. It's a subvariant of that, but it's basically is it still trying to hold any kind of connection to Trotskyism anymore, or is it excludes Stalinists and Maoists?
They definitely try to exclude, like, well, I mean, to their credit, they do actually theoretically and very purposefully exclude Stalinism, Maoism.
Yeah.
They're a really complicated organization as far as theory goes. Because, like, you know, on the one hand, they will tell you, read Luxemburg, she's amazing.
Yeah.
But she disagreed with the fucking Leninism.
Yeah.
And Trotsky was a Leninist. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
let's not split hairs about that.
Yeah.
She wrote a book called Marxism or Leninism. So if there's any more scathing bullshit, that is...
Well,
Yeah.
There's another thing, which is mentioned earlier before about updating communism. Like, doesn't it seem a bit redundant? Like having these outdated philosophies and be like, oh, well, if you're not this outdated philosophy, then you can't join our special club.
It's a very ridiculous sort of temperament to have. Like, there's a lot of like people like to sort of approach certain things with this idea of left unity, and I can understand why they feel that way, because the left does, to degrees, need to be united on different fronts to prevent this kind of onslaught of reactionism and pushing back of civil liberties, and and to be prepared for things like fascism, because fascism never went away, it just changed its stripes and stars, but a lot of people, especially like Trotskyists, Stalinists, etc., they're very anti-left unity, and even that I can understand why, because there is a problem where you will have your conversations dominated by social democratic politics, which are very establishment in their own way. But look, the reality is that they should be more open to discussions and joining with other people, collaborating, because I think the farthest I ever saw them collaborate was, say, on gay marriage or on the Palestine stuff, where they would use community groups but not other socialist groups. They would actually be very hostile to people like the Alliance or whatever else. So
I was going to say, it's like, maybe they'll probably go with Socialist Alliance. It's probably their closest friend. They turn up to the same things.
I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if they went out to like Manly or something, had a bonfire and burned all the Green Left Weekly copies they found.
Okay.
Not huge fans.
Okay, so where was your turning point then? So when did you start going, okay, this isn't maybe not for me?
Yeah, I started to have trouble with them about 6 months in, which is quite soon. No, but see, because that period of my life was rocked by a terrible relationship. It was very emotionally abusive.
Yeah.
My mental health was tanking fast.
Yeah.
I was basically an addict. I was drunk all the time, high all the time, and I couldn't mitigate myself in any way.
Yeah.
And that's just for the people at home. I have bipolar disorder and I have post-traumatic stress.
For sure.
So these things were really affecting me. My partner at the time was undiagnosed, but she also had post-traumatic stress. She was in a high-stress environment at work. And because of my stuff, it was also putting a lot more stress on her too.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of time where we couldn't be at meetings or rallies or what have you.
For sure. Yeah.
And that started driving a wedge. The organization started to be more hostile because we weren't putting in the same effort as everyone else. But, you know, the funny part about that is from each according to his ability, to each according to their need. But, so that was really where the wedges started to drive in. I remember one member of the organization, she was the first person to ever tell me that depression is a legitimate excuse not to do things.
Yeah.
And she was a member, and she was quite good, but she'd also had falling out with them before as well. But on the whole, it just started to degenerate, and I was becoming more and more stressed and hostile to those people who were showing hostility to me.
Yeah.
And I think I had a blowout over Facebook actually, with a member from Melbourne, I want to say. And actually, like, I just posted some asinine quote that I just found interesting. It was a philosophy quote, and I was responded to in a way that I felt patronized. And looking back, that sense of being patronized spoke more about my position feeling threatened as a man than it did anything else.
Okay.
So I was at fault for that, but that blowout led to another member who was, I won't say his name, but he'd been involved in union organization for Woolworths workers and won some things. He got quite fiery with me, and then I was just like, you know what, fuck this, and I just removed every one of them from Facebook. And the next thing I heard was them telling my partner that I was a sexist pig and that I was no longer welcome. And you know, part of me is like, that was a learning experience. Like, I could have done things differently, and that taught me to be more disciplined. At the same time, I would have at the time liked to have had a conversation that was more constructive and where I could actually get to the root of the problem. But no, they didn't want anything to do with me, and I think it just came from the consistent disability that I was having to be present. So it was an easy way to get rid of me. And they had done that to other people before.
Well, a lot of this sounds like cult behavior.
Well, it is cult behavior, and they character assassination is a big thing that they do. I remember one of the funniest character assassinations they ever did was of another bloke who he was starting to fade off, and that was because he lived on the other end of the city. He couldn't travel after work every Thursday to come into a meeting that was going to last till 9 o'clock. And when he finally left, they started saying, oh, well, you know, he was a really passionate animal rights activist, and he prioritized that more than human beings. And I was just like, are you fucking high, man? Like, what is wrong with you? Like, Jesus.
But it makes this kind of funny, which is, I don't actually know how many SALT members there are, like the numbers, for instance.
It's been up and down between something like, at times it's 400, 700. It's in the hundreds.
Queensland?
No.
Nationally?
Yeah, nationally.
Oh, wow.
Which begs the question.
It could be more now, but at the time that I was there, it was in the hundreds area.
Don't these people see the writing on the wall, and that then effectively at the national scale irrelevant?
I mean, funnily enough, they have tried to participate in the last election, in the last federal election. And that was in Victoria, and they were under the banner of Victorian Socialists, I believe.
Yeah. I was there at the time.
So I think they're kind of trying to like test the waters with some areas. because like their perspective on parliamentary politics is that it's a good gauge for working class consciousness, which is why they, as a general rule, tell people to support the Labour Party because it's a workers' party. Whether that's
or the Greens, I'm sure, as well.
Yeah. Oh no,
none of the Greens.
No,
Okay.
Greens. The position is that the Greens are a very middle class party.
I would agree.
With that. They're it's those trendy lefties who tend to. Although I will say younger Greens voters, like they've always been quite passionate.
There's some good people in the Greens. I'm not going to hate all of them. I just think as a large as an organization.
I feel like the leadership are more the problem.
Sure.
But so they generally tell people to support. In the absence of a good local member who is left wing, they say vote Labour Party, federally, council, etc.
I was always under the impression that they were abstaining from voting for a while there.
No.
I know that, but I think you told me that. I always thought that they just didn't want to participate at all in electoral politics, and I was like, why, guys? But I was wrong about that. Okay, well, I think that's. There's something else I wanted to ask you before it was on my mind. Oh no, a story. So, okay, so this is.
Hold that thought. I'm just gonna quickly make a phone call and go to the toilet. I'll be right back.
Okay.
I do have a question.
Okay. So my story was going to be basically that when this is a couple of years ago, but I was at UQ, weirdly enough, and this lady from Salt came up to me and said. What was it? She said something along the lines of, like, she was trying to talk about Salt, about giving to buy a newspaper or something like that. And I just, wanted to ask some questions, because I was like, have you read anything about it? And she's like, oh, no, I just think, and she basically almost gave me the same thing about socialism. Like, Marxism is basically just about caring for people. And if you're not a Marxist, you don't care for people, more or less, is the genesis of that conversation.
What people don't realize is that Marxism, as a theory, is actually amoral.
Yeah,
completely amoral.
Yeah.
Well, go on.
But I know. But but I was trying to be like, why are we not having a conversation about modern kind of communist thought, because and this gets into a broader conversation. But just for example, someone like Mikhail Gorbachev identified himself as a communist. You can argue whether he wasn't or whatever it may be. But if he says he is, we'll just take it at face value, like China, let's just say, for the sake of argument that he is, then no one's talking about what he wrote about, what he did. That conversation is mostly just he's a traitor and should be tried and whatnot. And it's he actually offered, he wasn't just one person. A bunch of people that he had in his coalition inside the Communist Party of the Soviet Union all backed his reforms, all thinking this is some transformational element to the Soviet Union. And we're not even having a conversation from the 80s, but we're still having a conversation from
20s, 30s, 40s,
Yeah. And what I mean? Should we update this conversation on some level? And it was just this, I don't know, I just really felt once again, at this point in time, I've definitely read more Marx and stuff now than I did then. But I felt I knew more than this person did, and they were trying to have them articulate this vision to me.
Yeah. It's sort of a weird thing. If you were to put 100 socialists who claim they were Marxists in a room, and then gave them a quiz about Marxism or historical materialism, whatever you want to call it, and how they could apply that to the world, you'd probably only find 4 or 5 that could actually do it. It's just because there's no culture of actual education there anymore, specifically in how to apply that education. And that's really one of the things that I didn't learn until after I left Salt. Mostly because they all they wanted to teach me was the history, and which is not a bad thing, but that's all they wanted me to do, and then get the broad strokes. And I remember actively being discouraged from reading Capital, which is they thought that that was an advanced thing, and I'm like, well, fuck you, I'm more advanced than half of your people, and I have a big brain. No, but
Capital is a hard read. But I think it'd be worthwhile, because this is at least a defensive Marxism, is that it's not just what people think it is. You know what I mean? There's often the characterization is just free stuff or whatever. But it's so much more complex. It's actually a bunch of mathematics. There's a bunch of just talking about basic commodification rules and labor value, and really breaking down what what capitalism is in the 1800s and how you then change it. And well, not quite how you change it, but like more analyzing it and really going into like very kind of, maybe not complex mathematics, but talking about like these equations and how they all funnel into each other. And you remember, if you're not following it closely, you get lost pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's true.
You know what I mean? Like, there's a whole conversation there that people are missing, and yet people are like, "Oh, actually, free stuff."
Yeah,
you know?
it's there's philosophy is actually a big overlooked component to Marxism as well. People forget that Marx was a philosopher.
Yeah.
That a lot of what he said was philosophy. He was a materialist, a dialectician. These were principled parts of his philosophy, and the way he applied them and then used like his analysis of capitalism and so on, like those are all important things, and I don't feel like it's introduced to people on a level of philosophy either. And it should be because
I think, well, okay, so two things, and we'll try and change the conversation soon. Just with Marx. So last in our first episode, I got you to listen to it. We had this. I've updated myself a little bit here, but we had a conversation around the Jewish question, which is a tricky territory, I know. But I just wanted to ask you about it because I recently did some bit of research into it, and so at the time I didn't think it was quite the fair analysis that was getting given at the time.
No, it's a complicated one.
But I think there's definitely like Marx was wrong on some areas, and I think the Jewish question is probably the biggest gaping hole in his ideas. Where in terms of like I would say he's Jewish, but I think you can have this kind of, if you agree, like it's a gaping hole just to be class reductionist on the issue. I think which is part of his problem. But I think the other element was like I think it also I think he accepted there was a problem, which he didn't necessarily need to do either. You know what I mean? I think he was trying to say, and badly did so, was trying to say that it shouldn't be, not the question we're asking should be about class, and really that's the overall way we should address this issue. So forget about anti-Semitism, really.
I think there were two prongs to that very questionable work. There were two prongs to that, so I can kind of understand his thinking. And like you just said, I agree with that. And I think the other one is that Marx was very adamant about questioning religion. He viewed religion as a sort of an illusion of the world, and that if you criticize and remove religion from the world, you actually find that workers, men, women, are looking at themselves now instead of like this kind of phantom out there. But the Jewish question was, but Marx can be wrong, like any theorist or philosopher or poly whatever. His conversations around the lumpen proletariat, essentially poor people without jobs. I thought it was bullshit, because we've seen a history of prison riots. We've seen a history of student rebellions, prostitutes or sex workers, as we now call them. Like, they've rebelled so much. And these people all have a revolutionary consciousness, which Marx didn't think they did.
Well, this is it was really interesting. I watched a lot of this American show called The Majority Report, and in that Sam Cedar, we talked about something recently, like what he thinks the difference between now and then in terms of like revolutionary politics and just the activism on such a level is like 1940s to now, when you had like these mass class like worker not going to say rebellions, but protests and fights with police and all this other stuff that led to a lot of the New Deal. They had a lot more time. A lot more people, like, because maybe out of work or whatever, they had time just to sit around and mull and get angry about their situation and do things about it. But a lot of people are now working so many jobs, they don't even have time to think about their problems. If you know what I mean? Like, I sit down and get angry about it because they just want to get through the next day. If you know what I mean? And this kind of change of dynamic has really changed.
It's one of those things where, what made self-education and discussion groups so important in the past was that people were being worked to death, and there was no room for education, so you had to fight for that space to have it, and then you had to ensure that they were getting an education that was valuable. Because things like the division of labor, which is intended to shut you off from everything else but your menial bullshit task for the day.
just to add in there, yes, I'm back, by the way. That was
Welcome back.
yes. Is when you go and say, oh well, people are working so many jobs today. Well, that's not true at all. I mean, the average the working hours of the modern man and woman is very different to the one at the turn of the
But I
century.
think, some people
14 hours a day initially, and now it's in some countries it's. I mean, for Australia, it's technically it's 8, but there's a great big conversation about unpaid working hours where it's like some folks work 10 hours, only paid 8.
Yeah, well, I think that's true, but I think in the sense that like you might work your full-time job, but then you're working Uber at night, for a couple more hours just afterwards.
I think
you know
it's a very relevant kind of conversation to casualization.
Yeah. That's kind of what I mean is that you're not working your one job as much as you used to be.
Yeah.
But you're working other jobs to make up for that lack of increased income. Like, and those are jobs that are hard to quantify, like Uber, like those things. So people now have like 3 different jobs. They might be doing extra work online, or they might be doing, you know what I mean? They're freeing all that free time they're meant to be having, they're filling up with more work. If that clarify what I mean.
But they're choosing to. I mean,
but they
in some cases it's a choice, in some cases it's not. I get that.
But you get we've talked about this before, but that 200% like debt. Like a third of the population has, or whatever it is.
Oh,
you know what I mean? Like that doesn't just
GDP.
Yeah, like that doesn't just happen out of nowhere. People are not making enough money, or they're spending terribly, which I'm not going to say is a large part of the problem. If they are spending terribly, it's usually just to make up for how they feel.
It's a little weird situation where we've all heard the phrase it's expensive to be poor.
Yeah.
Which has a lot of layers to what that means, but I also like to insert into that you've got all of these things that other people who are wealthier don't have to worry about, but then you've got quality of life stuff, and you'll find that people are a lot more judgmental of poor people who go for quality of life stuff than they are for middle class people or wealthy people. So as far as what people earn, they should be earning enough to pay off any debts they've had to take to get a car or whatever. And they should also be earning enough to be able to have nice things. To spend time at the beach, to have a good TV so they can enjoy their sports, those sorts of things. Exactly.
Well, it goes to a bigger problem, which is, yes, it's about quality of life, but people are willing to indebt themselves massively to get that quality of life. One example is this. In between 1995 to 2018, this is private debt to GDP. So while government debt at the moment is on the rise, thanks, economic managers. Cheers.
The best.
Actually, they're actually pretty good in comparison to us. So the people. So, for example, at the lowest point in that period, it was 120% to GDP.
Right. Today,
it is 209.6% GDP. We are
That's
worse.
Huge. Yeah.
And the reason is, but not to indulge your communisty attitudes, but
I have things to say, but go on. Yeah.
But I mean, ultimately, it's people. People talk about the American dream a lot. But what people don't talk about a lot in Australia is the Australian dream, which was a concept made in the 60s and 70s. Actually, and even before then, it was being developed after World War II.
Yeah.
And essentially, there is a certain lifestyle, there is a certain type of quality of life that every Australian deserves. It's that house, the fence, the car, being able to, 2 kids and a dog. Right? That kind of shit. Well, when you make economic policies that fuck most of the population, eventually people...
Looking at you, Liberal Party.
Yep. Or when you sell lots and lots of shit. And this is the government having sold off a lot of public assets that would have benefited the population in general, but that's besides the point. Well, people need to buy these things. They need to feel like they've accomplished something in life. And a lot of them earn a lot of money. There are a lot of Australian millionaires, technically. Technically. There are 1.2 million Australians who are technically millionaires. That technicality comes in household wealth.
Right.
Most of that household wealth is held up by debt.
Yeah.
To the point that when this recession, which we are officially in now, but we were technically in from 2017.
Yeah. Oh god, I tried to tell people this, and they're like, no, Corona.
Yeah.
Fuck off.
Yeah, like this is
I when retail started to shut down, that was the big moment that everyone should have known.
When I was up in North Queensland, like they suffered a cyclone, so obviously it's a factor in my vision up there, but they were not doing well before that. There was nothing for anyone young people to do up there. Literally, there's a lagoon. There was a cinema that was destroyed, like a small little cinema that was for kids was destroyed, and it was only put there by a community group. There was no market. There should be a market. There are a lot of people up there that need entertainment, but just no money. There's no corporate interest. There's no business interest. And like, there were 4 pubs in town. There was only 2 by the time I was there. Like those communities were just dying. And they've been dying for years.
I mean, Queensland has a great meme about. it's part of our state. It's one of those unseen things, which is our dying towns.
Yeah.
There are dead towns scattered throughout the desert. Scattered throughout the what is now wilderness because no one lives there. There was a town on realestate.com.au which you could buy that entire town for the same price as a flat in Sydney.
Wow.
Now, this happens when countries begin to die.
Yeah.
When you allow entire centers of your economy to wither up and evaporate. Like, death is one thing. A quick death in terms of like an economic collapse or something like that. That is a much more benevolent way to die than it is to slowly rot away.
Well, I think we're starting to change topic, so I'm going to...
But it gets back to the biggest point, which is... basically the economic situation in this country, yes, it was caused by the people in charge, right?
Sure.
But who voted for the people in charge?
Yeah.
Who also it's not a secret. You can look it up. You can go when you leave Brisbane, go or even like go 2 hours
north or whatever.
Looking at you, Gold Coast.
Or south. Yeah.
Or no. Go to Toowoomba and then travel 2 hours west of Toowoomba and begin to see dead towns.
Oh, yeah. Go west.
Go west, right? It's on us to notice.
Yeah.
And no one did.
Well, this is the thing. Like, last election, I think it was 600,000 people didn't vote or something.
Yeah, it was.
Which would have been pretty. Like, if any, like, I don't know how much difference was in the election in the end, but it was not that much. Like, I know it was a surprise win, massive win for the LNP, but no seats they won. They only won by like little bits.
Yeah.
Like, it was if any of those people had decided to vote, like, the election results of 2019 would have been solely different. But I just wanted to do quickly one last thing about SALT, and then I want to get into more of the topics of the day because I think that's what we're transforming into.
Should we take a break after the SALT?
Yeah. One last thing is just that.
And then your ideal communism. Anyway.
Well, one last thing is just that I remember probably my 2 biggest criticisms of SALT has been like what I saw is like not quite, I don't have to express this exactly, but kind of performative elements where they would get like usually foreign students to come in. And then they get them to speak on certain issues when they had only been a member of SALT for like a month or something, and go like, we've kind of not indoctrinated because there's no quick time to indoctrinate, but they've probably inserted a lot of ideas and gone, hey, you should speak on this because you're a person of color, and we kind of use you for our political purpose. And I saw this at education conference, and I was like, cool guys, that's great.
So you mean like tokenism?
Yeah. And the other thing was this is you've probably heard this a million times, but just when like say Indigenous protests.
Yeah, that's like, a big one. Yeah, absolutely.
Like they are expressly asked not to sell their newspapers there. They're allowed to come or whatever, but just don't sell your newspapers, and they just do it anyway. Yeah. Just despite being asked, like, hey, you're allowed to come, but don't do that one thing we're asking you not to do. Like, it's more asking your opinion on that, like, because that's probably my 2 biggest things with them, with just like, like we can get into leftist purity all we want, but like that's probably my 2 things, where they just kind of seemingly have a massive blind spot.
You have to judge an organization by its actions. That sort of thing I had a huge problem with. Like, you know, I could get over like the anxiety of spruiking on the street at a stall or whatever, but when I was faced with a crowd of Indigenous people and their allies trying to listen to an elder, and you're running around whispering in your loudest whisper voice, want to buy a magazine for $2 or $3, like, you got to be a special kind of fuck to do it. And I could not bring myself to do that. So I'd sit there silent as death, holding the magazine and rolling it up so no one would see I was one of them.
Yeah.
And, maybe that's like, they're going to say I was gutless or something for that. But the reality was I was respectful.
Yeah.
And if you can't, pump the brakes on your own... Like, this actually goes back to something I think I said about discipline.
Yeah.
You have to be disciplined enough to allow other people to speak, and it doesn't matter what your opinions are. If you're shouting over Indigenous voices about their suffering, you're just a bunch of white people framing their issue to suit you. You're not allowing for their conversation. You're not allowing for them to express that suffering. So you do have to shut the fuck up. You do have to kind of go, okay, we're privileged, let's not use that against people, even if we got noble intentions. As for the tokenism, I didn't see a lot of that when I was there, because Brisbane branch especially is tiny. I don't know if it's still tiny. I feel like it's still tiny. I think we had one international student there with us. He was fantastic, a real punk rock kid. We went to Riot Girl shows and stuff. It was fantastic. But other than him, I don't remember any international students. But at the time, it was just a lot of hijinks with young Labour, trying to force them into either committing to Labour or SALT, or stuff like that. So the tokenism thing, that wouldn't surprise me, being a more modern development with the group.
This happened at that same education conference. And once again, could not. Maybe the Brisbane branch is a little better. I don't know.
Oh no, never say that. No.
But my point is just I remember that I remember talking to them afterwards, because I'm the worst kind of person, because I go and ask questions and like talk to people and argue with them when they really don't want to argue with me. So after they did this, I was asking some questions. I didn't expressly go, "Do you think you're being used?" I was just being like, "Oh, how long have you been a member of SALT? What's the how do you feel about these issues?" kind of stuff. And I very quickly found out they didn't really know what was going on. They were kind of they agreed on the broader issues, and once I kind of narrowed down where they actually stood, it was quite different to what they pointed to.
I would say, there is a process of indoctrination. And I mean, that's a big, scary word, but let's face it, that's what these organizations do. It doesn't matter.
And it's not just SALT, there's other groups.
Exactly. Because you've got to convince people of your ideas. So if people aren't quite aware of it yet, then they haven't gone through that process. But I do want to say, just as a small tag on the end, Brisbane SALT sucks so bad. Melbourne branches are generally better. Sydney branches also suck. Sorry. Canberra, you beautiful bastards. They are by far, they're small as shit, but they're also fantastic people. I don't know if they still exist, because they were quite small at the time that I interacted with them. But they were so kind and so passionate and so disciplined. And I think that is so important. I think the rest of SALT could have learned a lot from them.
For sure.
Well, this goes to one final point, which is it's in a broader context, because I'm definitely of the opinion of acta non verba, actions, not words, right? And so ultimately, and also those actions should have a point, right?
Yes.
Which goes to, what is the future of SALT in your own opinion? Do you think that they're going to die out, or do you think they have an actual place in the future of Australian politics? And secondly, there's a great meme about communism, which is, yes, those communist regimes were horrible, but my communism would be great. So, as a fun little question,
no true Scotsman.
So what's basically is a bit of a fun question before we go to break. What would be your ideal revolution?
Ideal revolution, that's a big one.
So yes, the first point is, do you think these organizations, actually an addendum to that question, just as more relevance, do you think there's a chance for a communist party in Australia?
There is one, but
I'll start with the future of SALT. I think they're going to hang on for the foreseeable future. I don't see them going away, but I don't see them meeting mass appeal, because when we look at, say, movements in the US or Europe, We're actually seeing decentralized movements, like Antifa, for example. Black Lives Matter was organized, but is also decentralized. They made a constitution of values and demands. So they were more than just a hashtag. You know, you had the anarchist riots in Greece in 2008 in Athens, which were decentralized but organized, particularly against the parliament of the time. Those are the sorts of movements that I think are the modern movements. I don't think we're going to see assault-style party leader revolution or a change in the politics of the day. I think that's wishful thinking.
I think they'll probably ebb and flow with economic concerns. They'll probably, like, as we hit recession, they'll probably see a boost in their membership of some description.
Which is quite normal for left parties.
Whether it lasts or not is another thing.
It won't. I think my time in the Brisbane branch, it's membership grew and then decreased and grew and decreased. I don't think they're going to be able to shake that. So I don't see them being that important. I see them being, when they're good, I see them being a strong left voice. But I don't see them leading anything anytime soon. In fact, I would be horrified if they were leading something, to be honest. As for, what was the other one? Communist.
What's your ideal communist revolution?
My ideal communist revolution.
That's a good one, actually.
I you know, you can't plan revolutions. I think that's a big misconception. I think, you know, you can definitely say with the KPD, they formed during the fervor of the revolution. Their purpose was to create organization to give voice to these things and lead. But you know, they weren't in control. The Bolsheviks certainly weren't in control of the February Revolution. You know, and you know, Spanish Revolution and all that sort of thing. Like revolutions happen because of the material conditions of the time and the place. You know, in America, these riots, with how widespread they are, I think you could call it its own form of revolt. Not quite a revolution, but certainly that sort of build-up. No one made that happen, right? So as far as the role of like Marxists, communists, whatever is concerned, I think it's our job to remember history, remember the lessons, and try to have those conversations and help organize people wherever we can. I think we also have a duty to give people permission to be aggressive, because we are taught from day one, be a pacifist, get back in line, don't threaten. And that's a big problem. Like we'll talk about George Floyd and stuff later, but I want to use him for this point. There were people around him videotaping his murder. If even one or two of those people had the permission to intervene, that man would still be alive. People should have permission to do that.
And technically they do, though.
They do.
Because that police officer was committing a crime.
But, you know, people feel disempowered with that. They don't feel like they have that permission, and it's, I think the job of like a Marxist like myself is to say, no, you do have that permission. That is the right thing to do.
Isn't it the irony of our society? And yes, we are going to get to the topic of the day because it's a juicy boy. But no, it's funny because we're told to be pacifists and we're told to be peaceful in our nature, and yet our heroes, they were militant in nature.
Exactly.
I think this is the thing to forget about the civil rights movement, is that it was not a pacifist movement almost. Like, it was non-violent, but it was violent in the sense that they wanted violence to occur to them because they knew it would change public opinion on these issues, which sounds awful, but that's politics.
Well, they were certainly,
that's how they change
were prepared for violence. Like, you know, everyone likes to invoke the name of Martin Luther King Jr., pretending as though he's like this pacifist God.
Yeah.
That man had bodyguards that were armed, okay? He
Yeah.
knew what was going down.
He had guns as well.
So he definitely preached this kind of love and kindness, but at the same time, he understood the world. Malcolm X, the Black Panther Party, they were armed. They armed their communities. They educated their communities. They took care of their communities.
Well, isn't that the point of training? I mean, one of the big things with the military and with actually just any kind of militaristic nature is it's not about the killing or the fighting. You train because you make ready for war. There's the old saying: if you want peace, prepare for war. Because ultimately, and you'll see it from ex-military dudes who are now like the self-help gurus online and stuff, like Jocko Willink and stuff, where it's you train to be prepared. So that when it happens, you do it without a moment's thought. It's always that preparation.
And I mean that's another thing. Like a lot of people say with the queer community in Australia and elsewhere, people have these assumptions which in themselves are quite phobic, really. But it's that we're going to be those passives. We're going to be the ones that are more reserved because we're somehow different. But our rights movement started with a brick thrown at a police officer, and it turned into a riot that lasted almost a week. Then after that, we led mass demonstrations in solidarity with everyone, willing to use violence. Like,
I'm trying to remember, and forgive my ignorance here. There was because that was in Melbourne, wasn't it?
I'm talking about Stonewall.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was thinking of.
We had similar stuff.
There was a specific. I was thinking of the beginning of Mardi Gras in Melbourne or something. Yes. There was a clash that basically founded the first Mardi Gras here. Yeah. Essentially. Anyway, I've gone off topic, but you can.
I was just going to say that there's this phrase regarding queer people as well, that queers aren't cowards. We will fight too.
Well, Alexander the Great, gay as fuck, conquered the world. But I think that's that for this section.
We'll pause here and then we'll return soon.
Is the Prime Minister aware of recent comments suggesting that the 1950s were a time of great advancement for Australia, a golden age for Australia? Can the Prime Minister tell the House whether it's the government's intention to pursue similar outcomes?
About the nature of the Australian population, that they are all a lot of self-seeking people to whose prejudice and greed you only need to appeal and you'll get that reaction. Now, I have a different view about my fellow Australians. It's permeated my opening speech of the campaign and right through. I believe that when Australians are confronted with the facts of crisis, that they have sufficient commitment to this country to respond positively.
That the right to govern this country does not belong to Mr. Rudd or to me or to his party or to ours, but it belongs to you, the people of Australia.
I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man. I will not. And the government will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man. Not now, not ever.
For the complete mobilisation and the complete ordering of all the resources, human and material, in this Commonwealth for the defence of this Commonwealth.
I love Australia. I love Australians. We are the most successful multicultural society in the world.
Today we honour the Indigenous peoples of this land, the oldest continuing cultures in human history.
Australia, some people say, is trailing at the heels of imperialist America.
Well may we say, God save the Queen, because nothing will save the Governor-General.
We all know that Australia is the best country in the world in which to live. Our aim over the next 3 years is to make it an even better country in which to live.
We won't have a parliament. You can go back to your 50s, to your nostalgia, to your Menzies, the Caseys and the whole lot. They were not aggressively Australian, they were not aggressively proud of our culture, and we'll have no bar of you or your sterile ideology.